When I walked into the courtroom, my own son laughed at me like I was a joke, and his wife rolled her eyes as if I were already defeated. They thought I was an old woman chasing ghosts over money that was no longer mine. What they didn't know was that I had been preparing for this moment for years. By the time the judge asked me to speak, the room would fall silent, and the truth would change everything between us forever. Before I begin, if you've ever lived through betrayal like this, especially from the people you raised with your own hands, please leave a comment, and subscribe to my YouTube, because stories like mine are more common than we ever admit. I still remember the sound my shoes made against the courthouse floor that morning, a hollow echo that followed me like a reminder that I was walking this path alone. The building smelled of old paper and polished wood, the kind of place where secrets come to die or be reborn, depending on who tells the truth first. I straightened my coat, the one I'd bought years ago for church and funerals, and I took a breath that felt heavier than it should have. I had rehearsed this walk 100 times in my mind, but nothing prepares you for the way your heart pounds when the doors open and you see your own child sitting on the other side of the room, smiling like you're a stranger who wandered in by mistake. My son didn't even try to hide his laughter. It was a short, sharp sound, like a scoff, and it cut deeper than any insult he could have spoken aloud. He leaned toward his wife, my daughter-in-law, and whispered something that made her roll her eyes so hard I thought they might stay that way. They didn't look worried. They looked entertained, amused, as if this entire case was just another story they'd tell later about how mother lost her mind and tried to take what wasn't hers. I kept my face calm, even though inside something old and fragile cracked. This was the boy I stayed up nights with when he had fevers, the boy I packed lunches for and waited for when he was late coming home. Somewhere along the way, he had learned to see me not as his mother, but as an obstacle, a problem to manage. And standing there under those bright courtroom lights, I realized that whatever love he once had for me had been buried under years of resentment and influence I didn't recognize anymore. They thought this was about money. That's what they told everyone, that I was angry about the inheritance, bitter that I wasn't in control anymore, desperate to claw back something that time had already taken from me. They didn't see the nights I sat at my kitchen table, paper spread out like puzzle pieces, teaching myself how to read legal language because I couldn't afford a lawyer at first. They didn't see the way my hands shook when I found documents that didn't make sense, signatures that looked wrong, dates that didn't line up. They didn't hear the quiet resolve I made to myself that I would not let lies be the final story of my life. As I took my seat, I avoided looking at them again. I focused instead on the judge's bench, on the flag in the corner, on anything that would keep me grounded. My lawyer, a kind woman with sharp eyes, leaned over and whispered that we were ready. I nodded, even though my mouth had gone dry. Ready was a strange word. I had been ready for years, but standing there made readiness feel like a myth. The case, on paper, was simple. After my husband passed, the house we had lived in for 40 years was transferred in a way I never fully agreed to. My son claimed I had signed everything over willingly, that I understood the terms, that I wanted him and his wife to have it while I moved into something smaller. They said I was confused now, that grief had clouded my memory, that I was embarrassing myself by bringing this to court. And for a long time, I almost believed them. When enough people tell you that you're wrong, you start to question your own mind. But grief has a way of sharpening certain memories, not dulling them. I remembered the day they brought the papers, how rushed it felt, how my daughter-in-law kept answering questions that weren't hers to answer. I remembered asking for time and being told there was none. I remembered trusting my son because he was my son. That trust was the real inheritance they took from me long before the house. The judge called the room to order, and the low murmur of voices faded into silence. I could feel eyes on me, curious, skeptical, some already decided. Older woman versus young couple, mother versus son. There's a story people like to tell themselves about how those cases always end. I knew they were expecting me to stumble, to ramble, to prove exactly what my son had been telling them all along. When the judge asked if I understood why we were there, I answered clearly. My voice didn't shake the way I feared it would. I said I was there because what was taken from me was taken under false pretenses. I said I was there because the truth mattered, even if it came too late to repair what was broken between us. My son smirked, confident, like this was all going exactly as planned. As proceedings began, documents were presented, statements were read, and still they sat there relaxed, whispering to each other, certain that nothing I had could touch them. They had no idea that every smile, every eye roll was only strengthening my resolve. I wasn't there to humiliate them. I wasn't there to win revenge in the way movies make it look. I was there to reclaim my dignity, piece by piece, in a room where lies don't echo as loudly as truth. When my lawyer named my name and asked me to stand, the laughter finally stopped. I rose slowly, my knees aching, my heart steady in a way that surprised me. This was the moment they thought would undo me. Instead, it was the moment everything I had endured quietly began to make sense. I looked at my son then, really looked at him, and for the first time I didn't see power in his eyes. I saw fear, just a flicker, but it was there. And I knew before I spoke a single word that the story they told about me was about to change. I stood there longer than I expected, waiting for the judge's nod, feeling the weight of the room press against my chest. When permission came, it was subtle, just a small gesture, but it felt like a door opening. I began by stating my name and age, my voice steady enough that I barely recognized it as my own. I could hear my son shift in his seat, could sense his impatience, as if he were already bored with my existence. That hurt more than I was prepared for, but I kept going, reminding myself that this was not the place for tears. This was the place for truth. I told them about the house first, not just the legal structure of it, but the life inside it. I spoke of the years my husband and I spent paying it off, of the way the walls still carried the echoes of birthdays and arguments and quiet Sunday afternoons. I said I never planned to give it away while I was still alive, not without understanding every word of what I was signing. I watched my daughter-in-law glance at the clock, her impatience thinly veiled, and I felt a strange calm wash over me. Let her be bored. I had waited years for this moment. Then I talked about the day the papers were brought to me, how I had been less than 3 months into widowhood, how grief had made the world feel muffled and unreal. I described the way my son stood beside me, urging me to trust him, reminding me how hard things would be if I didn't. I explained how his wife answered questions directed at me, how she kept assuring me it was just a formality. As I spoke, I noticed the judge leaning forward slightly, pen pausing over the page. That small shift told me I was finally being heard. My lawyer asked me if I recognized the signature on the transfer documents. I said yes, it looked like mine, but it wasn't written the way I normally signed my name. I explained that arthritis had already begun to stiffen my fingers by then, that my handwriting had changed, grown shakier. The signature on those papers was smooth, confident, nothing like the way I wrote on my worst days. My son's lawyer objected, dismissing it as speculation, but the judge allowed me to continue. That was when I felt the first crack appear in the wall they had built around themselves. I reached into my bag and handed over copies of medical records, dated weeks before the signing, noting my diagnosis and medication. I explained how those medications affected my focus and memory, how I had told my son I wasn't comfortable making decisions at that time. His laughter from earlier felt like a distant memory now. He wasn't smiling anymore. His wife had gone very still, her arms crossed tightly across her chest. The courtroom felt smaller as the evidence accumulated. Bank statements showing irregular transfers, emails where I asked for explanations and received vague reassurances instead. A video recording I had taken months later on the advice of a legal aid volunteer, where I calmly recounted the events as I remembered them while they were still fresh in my mind. Each piece felt like a confession I had been holding in for too long. Speaking them aloud was exhausting, but it was also freeing. At one point, my voice faltered, and the judge offered me a moment to sit. I declined. I had stood through worse than this. I looked directly at my son then, not with anger, but with something closer to sadness. I told the court that I raised him to be honest, that I never imagined I would have to sit across from him like this. I said I didn't come here to punish him, but I couldn't live the rest of my life pretending that what happened was my fault. The silence after that was heavy. Even the spectators seemed to sense that something had shifted. My son's lawyer attempted to reframe the narrative, suggesting misunderstandings, mutual decisions, the natural confusion of an elderly parent, but the confidence from earlier was gone. The questions directed at me grew more careful, more precise. They knew now that this wasn't a woman grasping at straws. This was someone who had done her homework. When my son finally took the stand, he avoided looking at me. He spoke about his intentions, about wanting to help, about believing he was doing what was best for me. But his words felt rehearsed, polished in a way that didn't match the rawness of the situation. Under questioning, small inconsistencies began to appear. Dates he couldn't remember, conversations he claimed happened that I could prove did not. Each one was small on its own, but together they painted a picture he hadn't planned for. I watched his wife whisper to him urgently, her earlier arrogance replaced with tight panic. For the first time since this began, I felt something close to pity, not because they were losing, but because they had underestimated the cost of their actions. They thought silence meant weakness. They thought patience meant ignorance. They were wrong. By the time the judge called for a recess, the room felt different. People glanced at me with something closer to respect than curiosity. My lawyer squeezed my hand gently, a quiet acknowledgement that we were on the right path. As I sat down, exhaustion finally caught up with me, but beneath it was a calm I hadn't felt in years. No matter how this ended, I had spoken my truth in a place where it mattered. Across the aisle, my son stared straight ahead, jaw clenched, as if the world had shifted slightly off its axis. His wife no longer looked at me at all, and in that moment I realized that the laughter from earlier hadn't just faded. It had turned into something else entirely, something they would have to carry with them long after this courtroom emptied. When the judge returned and called the room back to order, I felt a tightness in my chest that had nothing to do with fear and everything to do with anticipation. This was the part no one prepares you for, the waiting after the truth has been laid bare, when you're left alone with your thoughts and the people who once loved you sit across the room like strangers. I folded my hands in my lap and stared at the grain of the wooden bench, grounding myself in something solid while the lawyers organized their papers and cleared their throats. My son's attorney was the first to speak. He tried to regain control, to rebuild the story they had come in with, one where intentions were good and outcomes were unfortunate but unavoidable. He talked about family misunderstandings, about how difficult it is to manage affairs after a death, about how my son had stepped up when I was overwhelmed. Listening to him, I could almost see the version of events they wished were true. Almost. But there were too many holes now, too many details that didn't fit neatly into that narrative anymore. When it was my lawyer's turn, she stood calmly, without drama, and began to connect the dots. She spoke about consent and capacity, about duty of care, about how trust between a parent and child creates an even greater responsibility, not a loophole to exploit. As she spoke, I noticed the judge nodding slightly, the way people do when something aligns with what they already know to be right. It was subtle, but after years of being dismissed, subtle validation felt monumental. Then came the moment I hadn't expected. The judge asked my daughter-in-law to take the stand. Until then, she had been shielded, sitting beside my son as if proximity alone could protect her from scrutiny. She rose stiffly, smoothing her blouse, her earlier confidence nowhere to be found. When she swore to tell the truth, her voice wavered, just enough to betray her nerves. I watched her carefully, not with satisfaction, but with a strange sense of distance, as though I were observing a scene from someone else's life. She spoke about logistics, about helping with paperwork, about trying to support her husband during a difficult time. But under questioning, her answers became defensive. She contradicted herself on small points, then grew frustrated when pressed. At one point, she referred to the house as ours, quickly correcting herself when she realized what she'd said. The slip hung in the air longer than anyone wanted it to. It told a story she hadn't meant to tell. As the questioning continued, something unexpected happened inside me. The anger I thought I would feel never came. Instead, there was a quiet sadness, a recognition of how far we had drifted from the family I once imagined we were. I remembered holidays where she smiled politely but never quite met my eyes, conversations where my opinions were tolerated rather than respected. I had dismissed those moments as generational differences, as harmless misunderstandings. Now I saw them for what they were, early warnings I chose not to hear. When she stepped down, the courtroom felt heavy again, like the air before a storm finally breaks. The judge announced that closing statements would be brief. My son's lawyer spoke first, urging compassion, reminding the court of family bonds, suggesting mediation as a way forward. It sounded less like a defense and more like a plea. When my lawyer stood, she didn't raise her voice or dramatize her words. She simply reminded the court that compassion should never come at the expense of justice, and that family bonds, once broken by deceit, cannot be mended by pretending nothing happened. The judge leaned back, hands folded, and took a long moment before speaking. That silence felt longer than everything that had come before it. I stared at my hands again, noticing how steady they were. Whatever happened next, I had survived the hardest part. I had told my story without shrinking myself to make others comfortable. That realization alone felt like a victory. When the judge finally spoke, his voice was measured, thoughtful. He summarized the facts, the evidence, the inconsistencies. He acknowledged the complexity of family dynamics, but made it clear that complexity does not excuse wrongdoing. As he spoke, I felt my son's presence shift beside me, a tension I didn't need to see to understand. The decision itself was still moments away, but the direction was clear. The ruling came calmly, without flourish. The transfer of the house was deemed invalid. The documents were ruled improperly executed under circumstances that compromised my ability to give informed consent. There would be steps to reverse what had been done, to restore what should never have been taken. The words washed over me slowly, each one settling into a place inside my chest I didn't know was empty until that moment. I didn't cry, I didn't gasp or clutch my lawyer's arm. I simply closed my eyes for a brief second and breathed. Across the room, my son looked at me then, really looked at me, and whatever he saw in my face made his expression falter. There was no triumph there, no gloating, only a tired woman who had finally been believed. As the judge concluded and people began to stand, the room buzzed softly with movement and murmurs. My lawyer whispered congratulations, but her voice felt distant. I was already somewhere else, processing the weight of what had just happened. Winning didn't erase the years of strain or the quiet nights of self-doubt. It didn't restore the relationship I once had with my son, but it gave me something I had lost without realizing it, my sense of self-worth. As we gathered our things, my son hesitated, as if he might say something. His wife touched his arm, pulling him back. They left without a word. Watching them go, I felt a mix of relief and grief that surprised me with its intensity. Justice had been served, yes, but the cost was a family that might never look the same again. Still, as I walked out of that courtroom, the same doors opening for me as they had hours earlier, I felt lighter. The echo of my footsteps no longer sounded lonely. It sounded resolute, like someone who had finally learned that standing up for herself was not an act of betrayal, but an act of survival. Outside the courtroom, the air felt different, cooler somehow, as if the world had shifted just enough to let me breathe again. People streamed past me, strangers absorbed in their own lives, unaware that something monumental had just happened inside those walls. I paused on the steps, resting my hand on the railing, letting the moment settle. Justice had been spoken aloud, but now I had to live with what it meant. Winning a case does not magically mend a family. Sometimes it only makes the fractures clearer. My lawyer asked if I wanted to talk, to plan next steps, but I told her I needed a little time. She understood. She had seen enough cases like mine to know that the legal victory is often the smallest part of the emotional journey. We said our goodbyes, and I watched her walk away, grateful for her steadiness, her refusal to treat me like a fragile relic. Then I was alone again, just me and the truth I had fought so hard to have recognized. I didn't go straight home. I walked instead, slowly, past shops and benches and the small park across from the courthouse. I sat there for a while, watching a mother push a stroller, watching an elderly couple feed birds with quiet coordination born of decades together. It struck me how ordinary life continued, even after something inside me had cracked open and reformed. For years, my world had revolved around what my son and his wife had done, around proving that I wasn't foolish or confused. Now that the proving was over, I wasn't sure who I was supposed to be next. Memories came, uninvited. My son, as a child, holding my hand too tightly when he crossed the street. My son as a teenager, slamming doors and apologizing later with awkward sincerity. My son as a grown man, standing beside his wife, laughing at me in that courtroom. I tried not to let that last image overwrite all the others, but it was difficult. Betrayal has a way of coloring the past, making you question which moments were real and which were already leading you toward heartbreak. When I finally went home, the house felt quieter than usual. The walls didn't echo the way they used to, and for the first time, that silence didn't feel like abandonment. It felt like peace. Tentative and unfamiliar, but welcome. I made myself a cup of tea and sat at the same kitchen table where I had once spread out documents in secret, afraid even to name what I suspected. I thought about how different I felt now, sitting in the same place with nothing left to hide. The days that followed were strange. News travels fast in families, even fractured ones. Distant relatives called with cautious congratulations, their voices tinged with curiosity and judgment in equal measure. Some hinted that I should try to reconcile, that life is too short for grudges. Others quietly admitted they had suspected something was wrong, but didn't know how to speak up. I listened to them all, nodding, thanking them, but keeping my own counsel. Forgiveness, I was learning, is not something you owe just because someone shares your blood. My son didn't call. Neither did his wife. At first, that absence felt like another wound, proof that the courtroom had changed nothing between us. But slowly, I began to see it differently. Silence can be a boundary, not just a punishment. For years, I had been available to them no matter how they treated me, answering calls, accommodating demands, minimizing my own hurt. Now, for the first time, I allowed myself not to chase after their approval. One afternoon, weeks later, I received a letter. It was short, written in my son's handwriting. He acknowledged the court's decision, said he was angry and confused, said he needed time. There was no apology, no acknowledgement of the pain he had caused, but there was something else I hadn't expected: uncertainty. Reading it, I realized how much of his confidence had been built on believing I would never push back. My resistance had forced him to confront a version of himself he wasn't ready to face. I didn't respond right away. I let the letter sit on the table for days, returning to it when my emotions felt steady enough. When I finally wrote back, my words were simple. I told him I loved him because that was still true. I told him what he did had hurt me deeply, and that trust, once broken, takes time and effort to rebuild. I said I was open to conversation, but only if it came with honesty and respect. Sealing that envelope felt like setting down a weight I had been carrying for years. As the legal process of reclaiming my home moved forward, I took steps to protect myself in ways I never had before. I updated my will. I set boundaries with professionals who spoke over me. I asked questions, even when it felt uncomfortable. Each small act reinforced a lesson the courtroom had taught me. Being underestimated is only a weakness if you believe it yourself. There were moments of grief, too. I mourned the family I thought I had, the future holidays that might feel strained or empty. I allowed myself to feel that loss without rushing to cover it with optimism. Healing, I learned, is not about pretending everything is fine. It's about honoring what was broken while choosing not to let it define the rest of your life. Sometimes, late at night, I replayed the sound of my son's laughter in that courtroom, not because it still hurt the same way, but because it reminded me of how far I had come. That laugh had been meant to diminish me, to keep me small and silent. Instead, it had marked the moment I finally stood up, not just in front of a judge, but in front of myself. And as weeks turned into months, something unexpected happened. I began to feel proud, not of winning, not of proving anyone wrong, but of enduring, of speaking when silence would have been easier, of choosing dignity over denial. Whatever came next with my son, whatever shape our relationship might take, I knew one thing for certain: I would never again confuse love with surrender. Life settled into a new rhythm after that, one that felt unfamiliar but honest. The house, my house again, seemed to breathe with me as I moved through it, as if it too had been holding its breath all those years. I began sorting through rooms I had avoided, opening drawers filled with old receipts, photographs and letters written in a handwriting that belonged to a version of myself I barely remembered. Each item carried a memory, and instead of overwhelming me, those memories grounded me. They reminded me that my life had been full long before betrayal tried to shrink it. I spent time in the garden that spring, turning soil with hands that had once trembled, signing papers I didn't understand. The earth didn't rush me. It didn't judge me for what I didn't know back then. It simply responded to care, to patience, to showing up day after day. There was something deeply comforting in that. I planted new flowers along the fence, not because anyone would see them, but because I would, because I deserved to live in a place shaped by my own choices again. Neighbors began to stop by more often. Some had followed the court case from a distance, piecing together the story through whispers and sideways glances. A few apologized for not checking in sooner. I accepted their words without resentment. We all make choices about when to look away. What mattered more was that I no longer felt invisible. When people listened now, they listened differently, as if they had realized I was more than a fragile woman clinging to the past. One evening, as I sat on the porch watching the sun sink low, my phone rang. It was my son. My heart stuttered at the sound of his name on the screen. For a moment, I considered letting it go to voicemail, protecting the fragile peace I had built. But something inside me said this was part of the path forward, whatever that path looked like. I answered. His voice was quieter than I remembered, stripped of the confidence that once bordered on arrogance. He didn't accuse or argue. He said he'd been thinking about the case, about his father, about me. He admitted haltingly that he hadn't wanted to see me as capable because admitting that meant acknowledging what he'd done. Hearing that didn't erase the pain, but it gave it context. Sometimes people hurt you not because you're weak, but because you're strong enough to remind them of their own failures. We talked for a long time, not resolving anything, not promising reconciliation, just talking. There were pauses, awkward silences, moments where neither of us knew what to say. But there was also honesty, raw and uncomfortable. When we hung up, I didn't feel triumphant or relieved. I felt tired but lighter, like something frozen had begun slowly to thaw. My daughter-in-law remained distant. I expected that. Some bridges aren't burned in a single fire. They erode over time until there's nothing left to cross. I made peace with the possibility that she might never see me as anything other than an obstacle. That was her burden to carry, not mine. I had spent too many years trying to earn kindness from someone who measured relationships in terms of control. As summer approached, the legal paperwork finally concluded. Everything was official, documented, protected. I placed the final documents in a folder and slid it into a drawer, not with fear this time, but with certainty. I had learned how to protect myself, and that knowledge was something no one could take away from me. Friends asked if I regretted taking my son to court. It's a question people ask when they're afraid of imagining themselves in your place. I told them the truth. I regretted that it ever came to that. I regretted trusting without understanding, but I did not regret standing up for myself. Silence would have cost me far more than the conflict ever did. There were nights when loneliness crept in, quiet and insistent. I let it sit with me instead of pushing it away. Loneliness is not the same as emptiness. It's simply space waiting to be filled with something new. I began volunteering at a local community center, helping other older women navigate paperwork, teaching them what questions to ask, what red flags to notice. Each conversation felt like turning my pain into something useful, something that might spare someone else the same heartbreak. One afternoon, a woman took my hand and thanked me for speaking up, for not disappearing quietly. Her words stayed with me. I realized then that my story was never just about inheritance or courtrooms. It was about visibility, about refusing to fade into the background just because the world expects you to. As the year turned, I found myself thinking less about what had been taken from me and more about what I still had. My voice, my home, my sense of self. The betrayal no longer defined me. It was a chapter, not the whole book. Sometimes when I pass by the courthouse, I remember the laughter, the eye roll, the way they underestimated me, and instead of pain, I feel a calm resolve. That moment marked the beginning of my return to myself. I walked into that courtroom expecting judgment. I walked out carrying something far more valuable than victory. I walked out knowing my worth. As time moved forward, I began to notice the subtler changes, the ones that don't announce themselves but quietly reshape your days. I slept better. I woke up without the familiar knot of dread tightening in my stomach. Even my reflection in the mirror seemed different, not younger, but steadier, as if my face had finally learned how to rest. Trauma doesn't vanish when justice is served, but it loosens its grip when you stop living in denial. My relationship with my son remained cautious, like walking on ground that might still shift beneath our feet. We spoke occasionally, never for long, and always with a politeness that felt foreign between a mother and child. There were no easy jokes, no casual assumptions. Everything was measured now. Part of me mourned that loss deeply. Another part understood that trust, once fractured, cannot be rushed back into place without risking further damage. He visited the house once, months after the ruling. He stood in the doorway, uncertain, as if he weren't sure he was welcome. I invited him in, not because everything was forgiven, but because avoiding him felt like another form of fear. We walked through rooms together, and I watched him take in the details he had overlooked for years. The photos on the walls, the worn spots on the floor where his father used to pace while thinking. It was the first time I saw him recognize the house not as an asset, but as a home. We sat at the kitchen table, the same one where so much had unfolded in my mind. He apologized then, not defensively, not conditionally. He said he had let ambition and resentment guide him. He admitted that he believed I would never challenge him, that my silence had felt like permission. Hearing that hurt, but it also clarified something important. Silence, I learned, teaches people how to treat you. I didn't respond with immediate forgiveness. I told him I appreciated his honesty and that apologies are beginnings, not endings. I said rebuilding trust would take time, consistency, and respect for my autonomy. He nodded, eyes downcast, and for the first time in years, he looked less like someone trying to win and more like someone trying to understand. After he left, I cried, not from sadness alone, but from release. I had carried the weight of motherhood like an unspoken contract, one that required endless sacrifice without acknowledgement. That day, I realized that loving someone does not mean surrendering your dignity. You can hold both at once, if you're brave enough. My daughter-in-law remained a distant presence, appearing only through indirect references or strained family gatherings. I stopped waiting for her approval. Some people are committed to a version of you that serves them, and when you outgrow that role, they don't know how to respond. Letting go of that need was one of the quietest but most powerful shifts I made. I continued volunteering, and the stories I heard mirrored my own in painful ways. Women who signed documents they didn't understand, parents pressured by children who framed manipulation as care. Each time I spoke, I emphasized one truth above all others. Ask questions. Take your time. Anyone who rushes you is not acting in your best interest. Saying those words felt like rewriting my own past, one conversation at a time. The courtroom began to feel like a distant chapter, no longer the center of my identity. I stopped replaying every detail, stopped wondering what I could have done differently. Acceptance settled in, not as resignation, but as clarity. I could acknowledge my mistakes without letting them define me. I could forgive myself for trusting, for loving, for wanting to believe the best in my own child. There were moments of joy, too, unexpected and gentle. A neighbor's grandchild learned to ride a bike in front of my house, and I clapped from the porch. A friend invited me on a short trip, and I said yes without fear of asking permission or justifying the expense. Small freedoms, perhaps, but they felt enormous to someone who had lived under quiet control for so long. One evening, as I organized old files, I came across the original documents from the case. For a moment, my chest tightened. Then I realized I no longer needed to keep them close as proof of anything. I had already proven what mattered. I placed them back in the folder and slid it into a box labeled Past, not to forget, but to remember where it belonged. I began speaking openly about my experience when asked, not with bitterness, but with intention. I wanted others to see that standing up for yourself does not make you cold or unloving, it makes you whole. The messages I received from strangers who had heard my story affirmed that. They thanked me for giving them courage, for showing them it wasn't too late to reclaim their voice. Looking back now, I understand that the courtroom was never really about property or legality. It was a mirror, forcing everyone involved to confront who they were and what they valued. For me, it reflected a woman who had been underestimated for too long, including by herself. I walked into that courtroom with my shoulders tense, braced for ridicule. I walked out with my head held higher, not because I had won, but because I had finally spoken. And every day since, I've carried that lesson with me. Your voice matters, even when it trembles, especially then. As the months passed, I began to understand that healing isn't a straight line. Some days I woke up feeling light, almost hopeful, as if a window had been opened inside me. Other days, old doubts crept back in, whispering questions I thought I had already answered. Could I have handled things differently? Had I pushed too hard? Was the price of justice too high? I learned not to fight those thoughts, but to sit with them, to let them come and go without deciding they defined the truth. My son and I settled into a cautious rhythm. We spoke on holidays, exchanged updates, kept our conversations safely on the surface. It wasn't the closeness I once imagined, but it was real. And real, I discovered, was better than forced affection built on denial. Sometimes he would ask about the house, about repairs or changes I was making. I answered plainly without seeking approval. Each time I did, I felt a quiet affirmation of my independence. There was one afternoon when he surprised me by asking about his father, not about the estate or the documents, but about the man himself. We talked about small things, the way his father used to hum while fixing things, the habit of leaving lights on in rooms he planned to return to. Sharing those memories felt like opening a door we had both been avoiding. For a moment, grief brought us closer than conflict ever had. That conversation marked a shift. My son began to listen more, to interrupt less. It wasn't dramatic or sudden. It was the slow work of unlearning entitlement and relearning respect. I didn't rush him. Growth, like trust, cannot be demanded. It has to be chosen. My daughter-in-law remained mostly absent, but I stopped interpreting her silence as hostility. Some people retreat when they lose control. That realization helped me let go of lingering resentment. I no longer needed her acknowledgement to validate my experience. The courtroom had already done that, and more importantly, I had done it for myself. I found new confidence in my daily routines. I made decisions without second-guessing how they would be received. I redecorated the living room, moving furniture that had stayed in the same place for decades simply because no one questioned it. Each small change felt symbolic, a quiet declaration that my life was still mine to shape. At the community center, the group of women I helped grew larger. Word spread, and soon I was hosting small workshops on financial literacy and personal boundaries. I never positioned myself as an expert. I simply shared my story, my mistakes, my lessons. The honesty resonated. People don't need perfection. They need permission to speak. One evening after a session, a woman stayed behind. She was younger than me, but her eyes held the same exhaustion I once saw in my own reflection. She told me she was afraid to challenge her adult children, afraid they would leave if she did. I told her what I had learned the hard way. If someone only stays when you're silent, their presence is conditional, not loving. Saying that out loud felt like closing a circle I didn't know was still opened. There were moments when guilt surfaced unexpectedly. Motherhood has a way of wiring you to believe you are responsible for everything your child becomes. I worked through that slowly, reminding myself that guidance is not control and love does not guarantee outcomes. Releasing that guilt was one of the most difficult steps, but also one of the most freeing. I began writing, just for myself at first, journals filled with reflections, memories, unanswered questions. Writing gave shape to emotions that were too complex to speak aloud. Over time, those pages became a record of transformation. When I looked back at the earliest entries, I barely recognized the woman who had doubted her own reality. That realization filled me with compassion for her and pride for who she had become. As another year passed, I celebrated my birthday quietly, inviting a few close friends. There was laughter, warmth, a sense of belonging that didn't hinge on obligation. My son called that evening, his voice steady, sincere. He wished me well, thanked me for inviting him even when things were difficult. It wasn't a grand reconciliation, but it was honest, and honesty had become the foundation I trusted most. Sometimes I thought about the judge, about the way he listened without assumptions. That memory reminded me how powerful it is to be truly heard. I made a conscious effort to offer that same presence to others, to listen without interrupting, without rushing to conclusions. In doing so, I found that empathy grew stronger when rooted in boundaries. The story of the courtroom began to feel like something I could hold without flinching. It no longer carried the sharp edges it once did. Instead, it felt like a reminder of resilience, of the moment I chose to stop shrinking. I realized dignity isn't something you're granted by others. It's something you claim when you decide your voice matters. Looking ahead, I didn't have all the answers. The future with my son remained uncertain, and some wounds might never fully heal. But I was no longer afraid of that uncertainty. I had learned that standing in your truth, even when it costs you comfort, creates a strength that cannot be undone. I walked into that courtroom underestimated. I walked out changed, and every day since I have continued that walk, choosing honesty over silence, self-respect over fear, and peace over the illusion of harmony. The following months felt like stepping into sunlight after years of living in shadow. Life didn't magically become easier, but it became clearer. Each morning, I woke with intention instead of obligation, aware that the choices I made now belonged entirely to me. I no longer measured them against what my son or daughter-in-law would think or how they might judge me. There was a freedom in that, one I had long forgotten existed. I began inviting friends over more often, sharing meals that once felt solitary. I cooked slowly, savoring the process rather than racing through it to keep my mind occupied. The house, which had always carried memories of the past, began to feel alive again. The garden bloomed under my care, flowers sprouting in colors I had neglected for years. Each bloom reminded me that life continues to grow even after betrayal. One afternoon, I received an unexpected visitor. A distant cousin I hadn't seen since my youth arrived at the door, hesitant and unsure. She had heard about the courtroom ordeal and wanted to understand what had happened. I invited her in, poured us both tea, and shared the story from beginning to end, not for sympathy, but as a warning and a lesson. By the time she left, she held my hands and said, "You fought not just for your home, but for your life. And you won." Her words struck a chord deep inside me. They were true. I had reclaimed more than a house. I had reclaimed myself. Letters and messages began arriving more frequently from women who had followed my story online through articles and social media shares. They told me they felt empowered to confront situations they had been avoiding for years. Some were small victories, like demanding transparency in a bank transaction or clarifying legal documents. Others were larger, like standing up to family members who had previously undermined their authority. Reading these messages, I realized the ripple effect of speaking my truth. It had become bigger than the courtroom. It was no longer just my story, it was a call to action for anyone who had been silenced or underestimated. Despite these affirmations, there were still moments of quiet pain. Holidays were complicated. Seeing familiar traditions, setting the table for family meals, reminded me of what had been lost. The absence of my son and daughter-in-law during those times felt palpable. I allowed myself to feel that grief without letting it define the experience. I still celebrated, still reached out to friends and extended family. Joy, I learned, does not have to wait for perfect circumstances. It can exist even in the gaps where betrayal once lived. One evening, I found myself on the porch watching the sun dip behind the horizon. The light spilled across the garden, illuminating blooms that had only recently begun to flourish. I reflected on the journey I had undertaken, from the first moment I walked into that courtroom expecting mockery to the months of rebuilding my life afterward. It was astonishing how much strength can grow from vulnerability. By allowing myself to be seen, truly seen, I had discovered resilience I never knew I possessed. My son reached out more consistently after that. Calls were still measured, still careful, but there was a shift. He began asking about my health, about my garden, about stories from his childhood. Our conversations, though not intimate, carried a mutual acknowledgement of effort. I recognized the quiet work it took for him to confront his own past mistakes. I didn't expect immediate forgiveness or warmth. That would have been unrealistic. But acknowledgement, honesty, and a willingness to try were enough to begin mending something that had once felt irreparably broken. The daughter-in-law's presence remained scarce, but I found peace in her absence. I stopped interpreting silence as defiance. Some battles are won not by confrontation, but by learning where to place your energy. I focused on the people and activities that nourished me instead. Slowly, my life began to feel full again, not in spite of the past, but alongside it. I also started journaling more deliberately, chronicling daily life, reflections, and insights. Writing became a ritual of affirmation, a way to measure growth and track the moments where fear no longer dictated my decisions. Each page was a reminder that I was the author of my own life, not a character in someone else's story. That act alone was transformative. A particularly poignant moment came when I hosted a small gathering at my home for women who had experienced similar betrayals. One by one, they shared stories of disappointment, loss, and resilience. The room was filled with tears, laughter, and quiet recognition. At the end of the evening, a young woman hugged me and whispered, "You showed me that I don't have to be afraid to speak." That embrace carried more weight than any legal victory ever could. The courtroom had been about reclaiming my home, but that night I realized the true inheritance I had created was my voice and the voices I had empowered along the way. Through all this, I began to notice subtle shifts in myself. My confidence was no longer defensive or reactive. It was calm and grounded. I spoke my mind without anticipating ridicule. I made decisions without hesitation. I stopped apologizing for existing. These were small, almost imperceptible changes, but they added up to a life that felt genuine and self-directed. Sometimes I still replayed the memory of that courtroom, the laughter, the eye roll, the disbelief that had once surrounded me. But now, instead of anger or hurt, I felt gratefulness. Gratitude for the strength it had forced me to discover. Gratitude for the people who stood by me quietly, who listened, who believed when it seemed no one else would. Gratitude for the realization that my worth was never contingent on anyone's approval. As the year drew to a close, I found myself reflecting more on the meaning of family. Blood connections do not guarantee loyalty or understanding. Family, I realized, is sometimes chosen as much as inherited. It is measured not by proximity or shared names, but by respect, care, and honesty. This clarity shaped my relationships with those who remained in my life. I nurtured bonds that were genuine and let go of those that were conditional. Looking back, I understood that the courtroom was the catalyst, but not the solution. It was a turning point, a moment that revealed the depth of my own resolve. What came after, the quiet rebuilding, the moments of reflection, the reclamation of my voice and home, was the true measure of what I had accomplished. Justice in a legal sense was temporary. Justice in a personal, emotional sense was permanent. And so I moved forward day by day, learning to trust myself again. I learned that peace isn't something granted by others. It is something you cultivate patiently, deliberately, with courage. I had lost much, yes, but I had also found something far lasting, my own power, my dignity, and a life rebuilt on my terms. The final chapter of this journey wasn't marked by a courtroom or legal papers. It was quieter, subtler, but no less significant. Life had taught me that true closure doesn't always come with a dramatic revelation or a grand apology. It comes in the small, steady victories, the mornings you wake without dread, the moments of laughter that feel genuine, the realization that you can finally inhabit your own life without compromise. Months had passed since the court decision, and the house now felt fully mine again, not because the law had declared it so, but because I had reclaimed it with my presence, my attention, my care. I walked through the rooms one evening, the sun casting long shadows across familiar furniture. Each object held a memory, but memories no longer carried the weight of grief or betrayal. They were mine to remember, not mine to fear. That evening, my son called. I could hear hesitation in his voice, a quietness that had not existed before. He wanted to come over, to see the garden, to talk, not about the house, not about the court, but about us, about the small things that had gone unsaid for so long. I agreed. I didn't promise forgiveness, nor did he ask for it. It was simply a willingness to begin rebuilding, cautiously, with respect and honesty as our only guides. When he arrived, I noticed the subtle changes in him, too. His posture was less rigid, his gaze steadier. We walked through the garden, touching petals, noticing the growth, the colors we had missed in our old hurry to control or dominate. For the first time in years, I felt him seeing me, really seeing me, not just as a mother, but as a person, as a force that could not be diminished. We sat on the porch afterward, sipping tea in silence for a few minutes, letting the air settle between us. Then he spoke of small regrets, of times he had misunderstood my intentions, of moments he wished he could relive differently. His words were tentative, careful, but they were honest. That honesty felt heavier, more meaningful than any apology could have. I told him that I accepted his acknowledgement and that rebuilding trust would take time. He nodded, understanding, without argument or excuse. Life after betrayal is never about forgetting. It's about integrating the experience into who you are and how you live. I had spent years feeling powerless, diminished, silenced. Now I felt powerful in ways I never had before. Power, I realized, isn't about control over others. It's about control over your own life, your own choices, and your own voice. My daughter-in-law remained largely absent, but I no longer felt bitterness toward her. I had freed myself from needing her approval or validation. She had chosen a path for herself, and I had chosen one for me. Some people never change, and some relationships never heal fully. Accepting that was part of my liberation. I had learned that letting go is not giving up. It is making space for growth, for life, for peace. I returned to volunteering with renewed energy, mentoring more women, guiding them through financial decisions, legal documents, and personal boundaries. Each conversation reminded me why I had fought so hard. Speaking my truth had been a solitary act at first, but now it rippled outward, touching lives I could never have imagined. I realized that courage is contagious and that the strength of one voice can create a chorus of empowerment. One afternoon, a young woman came to me with tears in her eyes. She shared that she had been struggling to assert herself in her own family and that reading about my journey gave her the courage to speak up. As she held my hands and thanked me, I felt the full weight of what I had endured. The courtroom, the laughter, the eye roll, all of it had been part of a larger story, a story about resilience, dignity, and the refusal to be silenced. The house continued to flourish with my care. I repainted walls, planted new flowers, and restored corners that had long been neglected. Each act of attention was a statement. I am here. I belong. I matter. These were not grand gestures. They were small, steady, persistent acts of reclaiming life, one detail at a time. I also began writing letters to myself, reflections on the journey and the lessons learned. One evening, I read a passage aloud. I walked into the courtroom underestimated, laughed at, dismissed. I walked out standing taller than ever, not because I defeated them, but because I found my voice and refused to surrender it. I am enough. I am worthy. I am seen. Saying those words brought tears, not of sorrow, but of quiet triumph. And then came a moment that surprised me. My son, months later, brought his own children to visit me. They ran through the garden, laughing, chasing butterflies. For a moment, I felt the ache of lost years, the moments I hadn't been fully part of. But I also felt hope because they were small, innocent, and untainted by past mistakes. Love could exist in its purest form again, even if the edges remained fragile. I realized then that family is not defined solely by mistakes or betrayal or lost time. Family is defined by effort, presence, and the willingness to rebuild. The past could not be erased, but it could be honored, acknowledged, and transformed into wisdom for the future. As I watched my grandchildren play, I thought about the courtroom once more. That room of judgment, fear, and tension had been the place where I discovered my own power. The laughter that had once cut so deeply no longer haunted me. Instead, it reminded me of how far I had come. I had endured mockery and disbelief, faced betrayal from the people I loved most, and emerged not bitter, but grounded, resilient, and fully myself. There were quiet nights when I sat on the porch, looking at the stars, reflecting on the journey. I acknowledged the pain I had felt, the heartbreak, the moments of despair. I allowed gratitude to coexist with grief. I accepted that closure does not mean erasing the past, but making peace with it. In that balance, I found serenity. I began sharing my story more widely, not for validation or recognition, but for connection. I wanted others who felt underestimated, dismissed, or betrayed to know that they could reclaim their voice, that justice is not always immediate, but it is possible, that dignity is not something others grant, it is something you claim. Looking back now, I understand that the courtroom was only the beginning. The true transformation happened afterward, in the quiet reclamation of self. I learned that strength is not the absence of fear, but the courage to move forward despite it. That independence is not the refusal of love, but the refusal to compromise your worth for it. That forgiveness is not obligatory, it is a gift you give yourself when you no longer want bitterness to rule your life. As I close this chapter, I feel whole in a way I never have before. The betrayal did not destroy me, it clarified me. The laughter, the eye roll, the disbelief, they all serve to remind me of my own resilience. I am older, yes, and I am scarred, but I am alive in a way that feels deliberate and beautiful. I have claimed my voice, my home, my dignity, and I know without hesitation that no one can ever take those things from me again. I walk forward each day carrying this lesson. Your worth is yours to define, your voice is yours to protect, and your life is yours to live fully. Everything else, the mistakes of others, the betrayals, the judgments, is background noise. I no longer shrink. I no longer wait. I live fully, unafraid, and at peace.